Welcome to Confessions of an Entrepreneur. My name is Carl Swansbury, and I'm delighted today to have Steve Carter joining me on my podcast. For those of you who've not had the opportunity to meet with Steve, I've known Steve for a very long time. He started his career in the recruitment sector at Corporate Hays before joining a number of other corporates as he climbed the ladder from rookie to CEO of the Robert Half UK business. At that point, Steve decided to scratch the entrepreneurial itch that he had had for many years and in fact bought a London-based agency, which he and an investor scaled materially, buying Imprint PLC in a take private and rebranding the collective group Morgan McKinley as we know it today. Steve's a really inspiring, highly experienced individual who's seen a number of recessions and a global pandemic, and as a consequence today is an advisor to boards, helping recruitment businesses start up, scale up, and in turn internationalized with one eye on improving shareholder value. Steve, without doubt, has to be one of the most experienced, most insightful, considered, and impactful board advisors I know. And as a consequence, I'm really looking forward to spending some time with Steve on my Confessions of an Entrepreneur podcast today. Steve, first of all, can I just say a massive thanks for agreeing to travel to the Northeast to appear today on my Confessions of an Entrepreneur podcast.
Thanks, Carl. It's an absolute pleasure, and the weather's tropical, so
it is.
Even better.
Well, thank you for bringing the weather from down south, because for sure, this is not typically the weather, Steve, we enjoy here in often miserably grey, wet, dark Newcastle. So welcome.
Thank you.
So many of our viewers might not know you, Steve. So it would be brilliant if we could perhaps just go right back to the beginning, just to understand a little bit about, I guess, where you were born and bred, given your accent perhaps might suggest to our viewers you are not a Geordie from the Northeast.
That's true. When you said I'm from down south, that's true. Born and bred in Sydney, and, started my career in Sydney. So definitely cut me down the middle. I'm an Aussie, although I've been in the UK now for 27 years. So I'm both an accidental recruiter and I'm accidentally in the UK because I came for 2 years but never went home.
And what was the pull to the UK? Despite all of the obvious reasons, why did you end up landing here in the UK, Steve?
So I was working recruitment in Sydney, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but I was seconded from my role to pitch for the contract for the Olympic Games in 2000. It was a project that my then employer wanted to win. As a result of winning that contract, I was given a list of any job I wanted in the company, and I moved to Asia. And I was in Singapore, and as a result of that, I then moved to London, and we thought we'd come for 2 years, big adventure, and just got settled into the lifestyle, and career went in different directions, and kids went to school, so never went home.
Wow. And your first proper job in recruitment, of course, was with Hays.
It was indeed.
Was it at Hays when you secured the significant contract you just referred to?
No, it wasn't.
Later on.
It was the next step, actually, because I'm the absolute accidental recruiter. In fact, when I went to Hays for a job, I went as a candidate. So I'm a classic recruit into recruitment. I didn't even know recruitment agencies existed, but I wanted to change jobs because I thought I was worth more money. And, back in the day I did that, it was find the agency in the yellow pages.
Right, yeah.
Right. So I went to what is now Hays and met a recruiter there, and she said, you should try recruitment. And I thought, this looks absolutely as easy as you could get. You sit in a room and you just talk to people. How hard can that be? Why not? Much to the horror of my family, who thought I'd thrown away a career as an accountant, and that was the end of the family. I was a huge shame to the family that I went into recruitment. So, and then I had subsequent moves, and the very next move led to the Olympic Games piece.
And tell me, you mentioned there, Steve, that perhaps your family were hoping you would obtain a professional qualification, i.e. becoming a chartered accountant. So what actually genuinely did lead you to conclude that that just wasn't for you? Why did you register with Hays as an agency looking to completely change direction?
So I want to tell you something that's, completely impressive, but it's not. I I had a girl that I was quite keen on and I couldn't afford her. So I thought I need a job that pays more money.
Right.
That was pretty much the motivation.
Got it.
And I'm married to her now and we've been together for a million years. But yeah, I mean, effectively I was a young lad. I was 21 years of age. I was working, I was going to university at night. Just wondered why the hell I'd ended up in accountancy. Just didn't fit. I didn't feel right. I felt weird. I was always in trouble for, playing practical jokes and doing things. I was trying to make it interesting. And just decided I needed to move. If I'm going to do this job for the rest of my life, I want more money. So I went to an agency.
Interesting. And what was it that led you to conclude then, Steve, that you couldn't create significant financial independence by being an accountant? Was there someone or something that led you to conclude, you know what, hey, if you want to be filthy rich, accounting might not be the right way to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just happenstance, right? Sometimes circumstances line up. So I had been working for people that I didn't particularly admire or they were not role models. I went to an agency and had a conversation, and I guess the person I met there sort of opened up this concept of, it's up to you how successful you are. It's not everybody earns the same. It's completely merit based. I'm really ambitious. I'm really driven. I like taking measured risk. And as a result of that, I thought maybe this is the right place. So, although I did, I just met the right recruiter on the right day that I thought, wow, you're pretty impressive. And I worked for some pretty unimpressive people in my short accountancy career.
It's interesting. It sounds like early on, Steve, you actually were given an insight into how you could control your own destiny. And by that, I mean, a lot of people are led to believe, whether it be as a consequence of education, upbringing, parents, but some people are led to believe that actually to do well, to succeed, you have to have a professional qualification, you have to go to a red brick university. But of course, that's not true. Because actually, as long as you understand money and how to make money, then you can be highly successful, right? And it sounds like perhaps your conversation with the recruiter allowed you to see under the veil for the first time.
Yeah, it just opened up the possibility that I was in control of my career.
Right.
It wasn't like I had to follow the path that everybody else had followed, which I was educated to believe. I had parents that told me that's what you did.
Yeah.
And I went to work in a profession where that's exactly how it worked. So who was I to know there was a different world out there? So, went and met a recruiter and, the rest was history, really.
Right. I'm looking forward to picking that up again a little later, because the one thing I always observe is that 99% of employees spend their entire lifetime climbing a corporate ladder.
Yep.
But the wealthiest of people create the ladder for people to climb.
100%.
And it sounds like early on you could sort of see that, which is something that most people see perhaps later down the track within their career. So obviously you were doing a phenomenal job in very large global staffing businesses. And I guess it would be great to start understanding when you started to ask yourself whether perhaps you yourself wanted to go into ownership, because of course your early career was all about cutting your teeth, learning and developing within big corporate recruitment businesses.
Yep.
So could you just talk to me, Steve, about when you first started to think about wanting equity, wanting a piece of the prize?
Sure. I don't think there was a time where I hadn't thought of that. Like very early, it was like, I could do this. I have 4 children and I had a family quite young and they were all quite young. So I'd always had to balance up the idea of doing something myself and put a roof over the head of 4 kids. And I'd always been in good jobs. I'd progressed really quickly. I had very senior jobs very young, a lot of responsibility. So there were financial rewards, but still in the back of my head was the idea that I'm doing this for someone else. And so it was really in my time with Robert Half, where I was heading up the UK business, that I was in a sort of more financially independent position. And I had the opportunity, I could take that step out. If it failed, I knew I could get a job. I was senior enough that and I knew enough people. So I'd sort of mitigated the risk. So maybe I did learn something from accountancy, and that was about risk and return. But really it wasn't I was ever held back, but I'd made choices about family, and that was way more important to me than career. So I compromised, and as soon as I had that opportunity, I took it.
And talk us through how that opportunity came about, Steve. So as you say, you were running Robert Half in the UK, a very significant professional services staffing business. And as you say, you were probably, earning significantly at that time. How did the opportunity come about, and what was it that made you decide then was the right time to make a leap?
Well, it's like opportunity walks past. So I had started looking around for a bit of a fixer-upper that I could buy as a small agency, but I knew that I could build it out, and had come across an opportunity to do that. I sought the advice of a chartered accounting firm about the possibilities of doing that, and they were pretty forthright, telling me that, you don't have any experience, you've worked for public companies your whole life. If you're going to go and fund this with debt, you need to get some, information about how to run and own a business in that level. So the only person I really knew that owned a recruitment company was a guy called Pat Fitzgerald, based out of Cork. Pat is the founder of what is now Morgan McKinley, or Org. And I flew over to Cork, and he was very generous with his advice. But also he said, look, we're looking for a way to expand out of Ireland. How about we become the bank? So you break open your piggy bank, we'll do the same, and we'll do this together. So we made a very small acquisition in the UK. And Pat's a fantastic man, and an absolute genius. But he, I hope I can say this, but in my contract was what he called the tits up clause, and that was, if the deal didn't go through, because I had to leave my job in order to be there, he would employ me for a period of time until I found another job.
Got it.
So we had this kind of backup as well. So he understood my situation with kids and all that sort of stuff. So.
And when was that? So when did you both come together to buy your first privately owned digital recruitment business?
Yeah, that was in 2005.
2005.
And we went out and did that, and did it quite successfully. And then the journey kind of continued there. As part of the board of that organisation, we acquired Imprint PLC a few years later, and took that public to private, which was quite an interesting process in itself. And then continued to grow that. So, and lots of parts of my prior career all sort of came together around that time as well.
Right.
So, I'd already done a China startup. So I got to do another China startup, but I already been there before. So yeah, it was kind of interesting, and he's a big entrepreneur.
And when you bought the first business, what was its size, perhaps headcount terms or revenue terms, Steve, just to give us a bit of feel for context?
Without naming it, because I don't want to describe it, but basically it was a rust bucket.
Right.
So it was a £6.1 million acquisition. We all took the view that if it went wrong, then we'd all go back to our day jobs, and we'd lesson learned. Probably had about 100 staff across the UK. Very much the old model of, find a geographic location, put a branch in it.
Right. Okay.
And, it was built around that. The previous owner had built it pretty much on his MasterCard, and had just taken a flyer on all sorts of locations. And so we knew that it had a substance of revenue, but it had no structure. It had no strategy. It had no it was just there. The market was conducive to open in a location, get on the phone, and we thought we could do it better.
And I mean, how different was it when you were running that business early on versus Robert Half? I mean, I know the answer, which is chalk and cheese, but genuinely, how did you climatize?
I found so many things shocking. So at Robert Half, I had not really appreciated the value of the brand.
Right.
For example.
You mean how powerful it is to have a Robert Half business card?
And I didn't even think that. I knew a lot of people. I was me. It was still me.
Wow.
And went out and rang the people that knew me and said, great, look, I'm doing this now. Let's have a conversation. And by and large, they were receptive, but they all unified on the view, but you're not Robert Half anymore.
Right.
You haven't got this big gorilla behind you. How do we know? You've been telling us for years they're the greatest business on earth, but now you're telling us you're in a different business. So yeah, I completely underestimated the power of brand. I underestimated in terms of recruiting people, in getting people to come and join me. A lot of people are like, I want to work with you, Steve, but who are they? You know, what is this brand?
Put us back to the first point,
Yeah,
isn't
right.
it? You know, people are naturally going to gravitate toward listed global business versus rusty bucket business in London,
Right.
using your
Yeah.
words.
And some people took a punt, but some people said, look, come and speak to me. Just let's have a look how it works. So I underestimated a lot of that. I had also lived quite, you get acclimatized to quite a privileged executive life, sort of the quality of flights you take or how you get to the airport or, who you lunch or where you lunch.
Right.
To a point where I became self-employed or a shareholder in a business and, booking travel or, Ryanair or whatever. It was just very different, but I'm not uncomfortable with that as a human. That's how I am actually. I'm not, but in a job, you get acclimatized to people, being sycophantic, probably wrong word, but like your job title means that you've got a lot of people around you, looking after you, looking out for you, organizing things for you. To go to a business where, you're in it and every penny matters and all of a sudden you've got to look out for all that. It was a big step, big difference.
Yeah. And of course, that's how corporates intentionally hold on to great people.
Yeah.
Because they make it so difficult for people to leave because they like all of these trappings. But the reality is, these are things that probably don't make you better, probably actually don't give you contentment, but nonetheless are nice to have, right?
Yeah. Although I think what's interesting, I didn't want to ever be owned by the corporation.
Yes.
Right. So, I had a equity program and as soon as shares would vest, I'd sell them and we'd go on a nice holiday.
Right.
I never retained the equity in the business because I had seen how the equity was weaponized to have people maybe do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. And I wanted to be a free thinker.
Yes.
I've never really been establishment from that point of view. So I was able to work in that model. I could fit well into a boardroom, but I wasn't establishment. And therefore I always took the view that, and I had many a conversation with the CEO about why do I do that with the equity? It's meant to be an exciting future plan. And I'm like, because you own me, I don't want you to own me. You pay me a salary, you'll get my attention.
That's right.
You pay me bonuses, you get my attention. But thank you very much for the equity. But as soon as it vests, I'm taking it because I've seen you lean on people with it. And I don't want to be lent on.
So the business you bought, I had circa 100 people in it when you bought it, in sort of, a period of time, which was probably 2-3 years before the credit crunch, actually.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that in a second.
Please.
So,
I'm still upset.
yeah. So from the moment you bought the business with 100 people, right up until March 27, which is of course the credit crunch, how many heads did you get to at peak?
Oh, we grew it dramatically, particularly around major markets like London. So we this agency had, because of cost, had like its offices were located on the outskirts of the city.
Right, okay.
So it was in Altrincham, not Manchester, for example.
Oh, it's just on the
Right.
out.
Yeah. So we started migrating then and swelling up. So we probably added about 50% to the headcount over a very short period, and started investing in developing a contracting business, which I had a little bit of, developing branding around, reshaping the look of that, and then sort of getting the right people in the job.
And how did the credit crunch, sort of from 2007 for a few years thereafter, affect the plan? So obviously you had this grand plan. How did it affect that plan?
Well, from a professional and personal point of view, massively. So what had happened along that journey, we got that first acquisition under the belt, and then circumstantially, we had an opportunity to make an acquisition. We made a big acquisition of Imprint PLC. Yep. So, we borrowed a lot of money. We sort of digested a business about the same size as we were as a group. And if you know the backstory to them, without me going into it, effectively, we had tried to create a merge or partnership with that organization, and they sort of dismissed us as hopefuls, like nice chat fellas, but no thanks. Then circumstantially, their share price started to drop, and it came into range where we could actually buy them. So it was also sweet that we got a chance to buy that business and then say, hi, it's us again.
That's right.
Sorry, fellas. Like, you should have been nicer to us. Right.
Right.
So we acquired that business. months after we acquired that business, Lehman's went bust. And we were a financial recruitment business fundamentally. So we got left high and dry with some debt from that particular client, but also, the world stopped, imploded. So hence I then went back out to Asia, because part of that acquisition, we'd acquired operations in Tokyo, in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Australia as part of the acquisition. And I'd worked there before. My kids were now a bit older, had the right passport, and we sort of drew straws at the board table, and off I went back to Asia again.
And that's because at that time you felt you physically needed to be present in that part of the business to, let's say, provide stability at a very uncertain time. Is that the reason?
That was one of the reasons. The other reason was we didn't really know the people, so they could have all just left and started up on their own. We had they weren't bought into our brand. But also we just believed that the fastest recovery was going to happen there. We believed that, like, for example, the China startup in Shanghai, we didn't buy a Shanghai location. We started that in the middle of that chaos. And the reason being, it was amongst other things, we just believed the Asian market would recover faster, and it did. So we happened to make the right judgment there. So I was out there doing my second China startup with the help of many, and really hitting into the other markets out there. So it was a combination of fear of, losing the investment, fear of losing the key people, but also the upside was the market was likely to do better faster.
And of course, up until this moment in time, Lehman Brothers, your career had only gone one way, which was a positive trajectory. You sort of bought your platform asset. You just acquired Imprint. So actually, to that point, everything outside looking in is just going to plan. I'd love to really understand how you felt personally, given your risk profile had changed, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, and you could see that for the first time, perhaps parts of the business were at jeopardy, or perhaps, you were questioning the viability of this thing. How was that making you feel as someone who had, clearly a lot at stake?
It still makes me feel a bit, nauseous now when you mention it. And on two levels. As you said, my personal career had always gone on the up and up. Like, I'd done lots of really interesting things, and my career in recruitment is sort of a life less ordinary as a recruiter. I'd, traveled, I'd done Olympic Games, I'd done China startups, I'd done all sorts of really interesting things that people get sold at the interview but never get to do. I'd gotten to do. So it was a, complete it was a real moment of confrontation where not only, I had to sit in front of the bank and effectively commit to work for free from that point on until we'd established some financial footing. I had to return a bonus, which is, so as a person, my career, which had gone up and up, moved from nothing could go wrong to it was very personally confronting. And so I was confronted with, financial choices, that I had to make as an individual that I never contemplated I'd ever have to do. And then probably more importantly was we had, 400 plus employees. All of their livelihoods were at stake. I had to sit in front of people I cared about, that I had worked with, and talk to them about loss of their job or change of their job or salary and closing locations. We had this cataclysmic drop in revenue in a single year, and the only way to survive was to make cataclysmic cuts in cost and reshape the business. And so for someone who is very team orientated and really believes in the people that they work with, it was awful. It was really, really awful, and my personal side, that was a shock to me, but that wasn't awful. I could deal with that. But the people I had to sit in front of and say, you know what, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. That was terrible. And it still haunts me now.
No, it's never easy, that. And how close to the wire did it get?
Very.
And what does very mean?
Very means that as a part of that team, I was very fortunate. People that I still friends with now that I'm not in business with, but they still continue to run that business. They were very adept, and it became a game of I mean, there was a moment where I guess it was like a game of chicken with the bank.
Yep.
Like, you know what, guys, if you want to call it in, that's fine. We'll just start down the road and we'll screw you over, in summary. And how brave are you? And the bank sort of poking us back saying, well, how brave are you? And, you know, fortunately, some of the guys I worked with were unbelievably good and still are unbelievably good negotiators and business people. And they represented us at the bank and got the bank to give us some space.
Yep.
And we went from there. And in fact, probably the hardest thing I've ever been involved in, hardest thing we had ever done, but in a really macabre way, the most satisfying, because that business is still doing well and growing and doing all sorts of things. And it came from that point where pretty much, you know, I described it at some point. It was a bit like bungee jumping, where we were close enough to the ground you could touch it, but we didn't quite hit it.
Right.
And that's how it felt.
And presumably there is something satisfying in that now looking back, because I think only when the proverbial is very close to the fan do you actually realize what you are capable of.
100%.
And I bet you've observed you doing things that perhaps you didn't know you were capable of at that time.
Yeah, it was a catalyst for a lot of things for me. First and foremost, I didn't ever want to do that again.
Yeah.
I think it completely rebuilt me as a professional. It made, like, what I do now is a direct result of that period.
Yes.
Where when we got through it and things were stable, I just wasn't satisfied. I couldn't settle back into a normal day job because I was just beaten up by it. You know, it was a long downturn, you know, and I've been through a few in my career and it felt long and it was tough for a long time, you know, and just didn't want to go there again.
No.
And I guess then it was like, you know what, I want to take more direct control over what I do. And I want to get involved with businesses that I can help that I don't want to see them do that. But yeah, it really reshaped the way I thought about the future of my career and the industry for that matter.
Right. All right. No, it's really inspiring to hear you say what you said. And of course, when we talk a little bit about what you now do, you know, the experience and the hindsight and the knowledge you bring to bear for the benefit of the boards you work with is significant as a consequence of what you've seen, right? So almost you should now be grateful for the challenges that you've had to endure, albeit I appreciate at the time.
I know I'm a better person. I'm a better professional. Yeah. Like anything, you know, I didn't appreciate that at the time.
Of course not.
You know, you're just going through it. But when you get out the other end and you start looking forward, it just, in a way, it was more what I don't want to do going forward rather than what I do want to do. Yeah. Because I didn't want to do that again.
Yeah.
And, you know, yeah.
Well, sometimes knowing the things you don't want to do means actually there's fewer things you do want to do. Therefore, making the choices to what to do next more straightforward.
Yeah. And look, I think, you know, like maybe a bit deep, but I think I'm a better person as a result. You know, I had to do things in that period for the greater good of the business. And it's made me challenge, you know, like as a shareholder, it was really I was very divided about, look, I need to protect mine and other people's interests. And I was part of a team. I wasn't on my own, but all these other people are just sort of victims around that. So I started to look at things completely differently.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because everyone is different, but I think you work out who someone really is when they have to make difficult decisions at a difficult time. And by that, I mean, if you look at COVID as an example, pre us knowing there was going to be a furlough scheme, it was fascinating to see certain people decide to make redundancies whilst not perhaps taking a pay cut themselves, or not perhaps giving back dividends or bonuses drawn. Point being, I think often there's a massive conflict between shareholder and director. And sometimes if you're not careful, the director's doing what's right for the shareholder, especially if it's the same person.
Yep, 100%. And yeah, it's a cliche, right? Work on your business, work in it. Yeah. But it's the most common thing I talk to people about. You know, we have separate meetings.
You have to.
Because you can't do both at once.
Yeah, I agree. And certainly during COVID, the one thing that I observed to many individuals and boards that I was working with at that time was, you know what, you'll be judged based on the things that no one sees you do. And I think a lot of people made calls that probably they are paying for today, but we'll come on to that a little bit further down the track, Steve. So obviously you came out of that really difficult trading period. And as you say, very quickly, you made good ground. due to the limited time we have, could you just sort of give me an insight into when you decided to effectively cash in your chips and exit the business that you had built, Grandeur?
Yeah, and it comes down to that period about how I felt as a person. So I would attend board meetings and contribute as normal, but it was almost like I had a sort of slightly out of body experience, which I know sounds a bit too weird, but be contributing to a meeting, but consciously thinking, what am I doing here?
Yes.
Where am I adding value? Why are we even talking about that? We just had a 1 hour conversation about something that doesn't really matter anymore.
Right.
Like, why are we bothered?
Yeah.
And I started to almost debate with myself, how am I going to have an impact? How am I going to help the business go further forward? And so I just decided it was time to step off. On good terms as well with the director.
And just on that, that's really interesting. So are you saying the business got to a side and a level where you didn't feel you had anything to add? Or are you saying because you'd seen perhaps what's more important to you in life, actually you just didn't have the want to go through the motions with this board? Because those are different things, aren't they?
And probably more towards the latter. But actually, I still see it today. You go into board meetings and things that people see as, completely mission critical are just completely distracting. They're not relevant. So, I became very aware of things that really weren't for the greater good. They were just stuff.
Because you'd been forced to focus on the things that do matter.
Yeah, and all of a sudden we were back talking about the fluff.
Got it.
And I'm like, you know what? One thing we should have learned was like, don't worry about that stuff.
Yeah.
It works itself out. We've got great people. I'll sort it out. We should be doing really meaty things that set us forward. Yeah. But it was a bit like I was having the conversation and I had another voice in my head going, you could leave for the next hour and it wouldn't make any difference. Think about higher impact. And I think I'm quite a creative thinker. So it was a bit like we could innovate. We could do new things. We can do it. Because one thing I also learned from that period, was that there was not a lot of innovation, right? It was more, even now I see it, the market's going to bounce back. It's all going to be fine.
That's right.
Right? It always bounces back. It's resilient. And so everyone was waiting for the bounce. And I'm thinking, can't we do something more creative? Can't we find a different way? Which is, fortunate. But yeah, I guess it was just that moment of, why am I here? Like, I need to do this for me. I need to go and do it with people actually that really will get a lot of value from what I do. I don't want to be a talking head in a suit around a table, where, not just that. I still go to board meetings where, we spend a considerable amount of time debating what we're having for lunch. I'm like, that's not adding value to anything.
No.
Let's get into it. Let's do it properly.
Okay. No, that makes sense. I think when you're forced to understand the things that really matter, I think you have limited tolerance and interest to indulge in areas that don't matter. And I can see why that would have been frustrating. Okay. So when did you actually cash in your chips and leave the business?
2015. And, I was very fortunate at Robert Half and subsequently Morgan McKinley to have the same chairman who I had worked with. And when I was asked for a recommendation at Morgan McKinley, I recommended Stuart Rogers, who also I had worked with before. And Stuart was just having catch up with me one day. And I just said to him, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore, Stuart. And he said, we had a chat and he said, mate, if you don't want to do it, then let's find a way to make it work for everybody.
Yes, right.
And it was great. So I had a very soft exit. It was all very nice. I'm still on great terms with everybody. So that was in 2015.
So 10 years ago.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought it through to the point where I hadn't really discussed it with my wife.
Oh, really?
So I kind of went home and said, oh, but by the way, I sort of half resigned today and had a chat to Stuart. And she's like, what? Well, I mean, she knew where I was in my headspace, but I hadn't it just happened. It was the right moment. So, yeah. And then it was just all go from there.
And just help me sort of reconcile 2 points, Steve, because of course, in your early career, perhaps a risk-averse, considerate individual, always were thinking about sort of risk reward and not wanting to ever do anything that would undermine your financial position, given your family's circumstances. So how did that person become the guy who just on the hoof resigned without even speaking to the missus? I mean, those two people feel like different people.
Yeah, I think that person's always been there.
Yes.
It's just circumstances always meant that that person had to be suppressed slightly. You know, but it was more like I was just expressing where I was at, and I did feel quite liberated by the ability to do that, and just I was immediately optimistic about what I could do.
Right.
Like I just felt like, wow, you know,
So
I can go.
presumably you knew immediately it was the right call.
Oh yeah, I knew, and it was just a bit like, look, let's just do this, and then let's just go for it.
For how many years prior to you sitting down with the chair and saying, you know what, I think this is me done? For how long did you feel that way, but suppress it or ignore yourself? Or
Probably a couple of years.
right, okay,
Yeah, because I come out of the post sort of downturn and got back into business as usual. And, you know, it was nice to take a breath for a while.
yes,
But then I started to get the ambition power came back on again. I need to get further. I need to move forward. What could we do? And I'd started to see things through a different lens, you know, like why do all recruitment companies basically look the same?
yeah,
Why do they all kind of do the same? Why don't we do it different? What about the customer? Who's talking about them? And then sort of just started, and that was going on in my head the whole time. And in fact, I was the decision actually happened. I was speaking at a conference in Singapore, and I was in front of the audience speaking to them, and I was just doing stuff I'd done before, and then sort of went out afterwards, just sort of had this moment of like, you know, those people will listen to me today, and then tomorrow they won't remember a thing I said, nor any of the other speakers. They're in Singapore for fun, sort of a work thing. And,
yes,
you know, and I just started thinking, actually, you know, and so I just sort of decided, and then it just was a case of when.
Interesting. Okay. So when you told your chairman that, you know, you were thinking about life beyond the business, of course, that was something that was probably over many months sort of managed. And of course, on a very amicable basis, you stepped away. Financially, when you look back, was that the right call? And did you manage to cash in your chips in a material way without talking specifics?
Yes. So initially I left my chips in, and they allowed me to just go get a job somewhere else. Yeah, I was a good leaver, no problem. And I believed in what they were doing.
Right.
But I have subsequently exited financially.
Okay.
And that was just another amicable conversation where we just sat down, and, you know, I guess I'd been gone long enough that I was a bit of a ghost of Christmas past.
Sure.
And for me, it was a bit like, guys, you're taking the thing in a different direction. And if I consider myself an investor, that may not be a choice I would take if I was an employee or a director. So is there a way? And, you know, that was all just as amicable.
Yes.
In fact, still, we're all, you know, we see each other every year.
Totally.
You know, for an old boys sort of get together. So it's good.
Yeah, awesome. Love that. So, again, for the benefit of our viewers, Steve, who might not have had the pleasure of meeting you or understanding what you now do, could you just talk about what you've therefore spent the last 10 years doing, if that's okay?
Yeah. So I consult to recruitment businesses fundamentally, and that's evolved beyond me into a business, which very happy to talk about Satori. But it was really challenging the norms, you know, looking at recruitment through a different lens, is saying, why does it have to work like that? And even now, you know, I see things today. I'm reading articles on the way up on the train about AI and things like that. And I think people are still looking at things through the same lens, you know, so I'm trying to disrupt the way recruitment works. I'm trying to show people there are other ways. I'm trying to learn from other industries and other sectors about their transformation journey as a business to meet, you know, exceed customer expectation or create new norms about how people consume services. And that's what I'm really focused on is, you know, why do it the same? And, you know, there's going to be people that erupt out of all situations and succeed. But I just don't think this herd mentality of it's a recruitment, so that's how we do it. And that's the grandparented norms. I just don't see the future in that.
Yeah. No, well, that's quite inspiring because you mentioned there the customer and the need to focus on the customer. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, if you think about how we now book our taxis or how we now buy our groceries, apps, we don't walk to the high street perhaps now. You know, we're not standing in a taxi line. Yet recruitment agencies still operate as they did 20 years ago, doing on-site registrations, filling in bits of paper.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
It makes no sense whatsoever. And that's the recruitment bubble everybody's in. Because partly a lot of micro entities in the sector.
Yep.
So a lot of people with a lot of skin in the game and big investment in their financial future.
Yep.
Therefore, they're not really voting for change.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
You know, so I get that too.
Right?
Yeah, correct. So I understand why, but I also get frustrated by the language of it's very internal. Like the industry talks to itself like it doesn't have any external interaction. So in recruitment, you know, this will work. AI won't replace people. Well, yeah, but your clients all have AI too.
That's right.
And so do your candidates.
That's right.
But we don't talk about it in the context of how do we fit into a bigger ecosystem. We just talk about it as in, well, you know, it won't cost any jobs, right?
Why is that, do you think?
It's just, okay, so there's, fortunately or unfortunately, it's a bit like recruiters were all born from the same gene pool somewhere. And all the grandparents acknowledge everybody's working on their slight version of the same truth that 50 years ago was actually true.
Okay.
It's just the interpretation. So,
Yes.
you know, when you look at a recruitment agency, the way they're structured, the leadership infrastructure in most agencies is somebody checking the work who's checking the work. They're all doing the same job, just slightly bigger versions of the same job. And that's because that's just how that's where everyone's comfortable. You know, but you don't see a lot of people in recruitment businesses. Like if you want to, I mean, some of the bigger agencies will have a head of innovation. Well, for me, it's a bit like, well, if you want to innovate, make someone responsible for innovation, because there's a lot of scope to innovate in recruitment.
Right.
But a lot of agencies live hand to mouth. So like, what if I'm wrong? What if it breaks? Then I'm out of business in a very short amount of time. So I'll keep backing the same old thing. And it's just this grandparented view. There's also a lot of pundits in the market that earn a good living from saying nothing's going to change. And therefore they proliferate that message.
Yes.
And all the disciples of the, you know, I call it the flat earthers, all go, yeah, great, nothing's going to change. They said it's okay. They've got grey hair. They know what they're doing. You know, but clearly it is.
I've never heard the phrase flat earthers before.
Yeah.
I like it. That's good.
There's a lot of flat earthers in recruitment.
Well, across all sectors, but that's a different podcast, Steve. For sure it is, but I'm with you. Let me ask you a question, because you said a few things in there which are quite fascinating. So obviously, you now spend all of your time advising boards, be it as a board advisor, a non-exec, a chair, or similar. And of course, each business will have a different vertical or a different end sector of focus, and they'll be of different shapes and size. But what is the one thing, and it has to be one thing, accepting there will be many, what is the one thing that you think the CEOs of those businesses are guilty of when it comes to their ability to scale their business? What's the consistent you see?
The blindness towards inefficiency. So out of an inefficient business, you can still make money. But nobody looks at how inefficient the business is.
How more money you could make.
Yeah, like recruitment companies fill 25% of the jobs they get.
Yes, right.
No one's spending, you know, a recruiter, an individual recruiter or a manager can fill 25% of the vacancies they bring in and be on the plane to Vegas and go on the company trip and be at the lunch. But they lost 75% of the opportunities. If I owned a manufacturing company or distribution company and I wasted 75% of the opportunities, then we'd be broke. Recruitment's just been afforded this massive marketplace that you can be systemically inefficient, and a lot of the boards, even ones I work with, will sit there and congratulate each other for a great quarter. We beat target. But by beating target, they still failed more times than they succeeded. And that doesn't cut it anywhere else.
No, it doesn't. And I've seen what you are referring to many times as well, Steve, so I agree. But let me ask, how do you get that CEO who doesn't see things as you do, to see things as you do? How do you encourage change? How do you sort of positively try and inspire people to appreciate the value being left on the table, so to speak?
Yeah, it's tough because, again, those people all come from the same gene pool as well. That, over the last 20 years, they've been successful doing it a certain way. And, they think slight changes to what they've done have been massive innovation, when the rest of the world's just moving at pace around them and recruitment hasn't changed. But look, it comes down to a number of things. One is, showing people about return on investment and, return on that performance. So, for example, we've spoken about this before, but this whole concept, this red zone concept, that, when you move the ball down the field to the point you're in a scoring position, you should score.
That's right.
Recruitment businesses, if you think about the process at the front end, from origination all the way through nurturing the database, etc., that's all progression to the red zone. And yet you get to the red zone and you don't score, and then you just go and start that process again and again and again. When I show people that in practical terms about the cost of that, and the fact that in recruitment, a lot of the time you don't get paid unless you succeed. So a lot of that work is, they've sinking capital into failing more often than they're succeeding. And you can put it in a financial context, you can put it in a resource context, an investment context. The penny does ultimately drop, but it is very difficult for people to pivot to doing different things. So as much as I demonstrate that, sometimes it's small changes.
A question for you. So I obviously run an advisory business, and we use timesheets.
Right.
So we allocate, can you believe, our time in 15-minute segments.
I think I've drawn checks. So.
There you are. That's right. You've been a client of a professional services firm.
Yes.
And of course, that's one really good way of keeping professionals honest, because I have to account for my time and I need to bill my time. I can't afford 75% of my time to be written off, using your analogy. So why doesn't recruitment as a professional services sector, why don't they have timesheets?
Okay, so that's a huge question, because there's a whole range of different responses. So first and foremost, I agree with you. Why would you put all that work in for no result?
Yes.
So ultimately, your time is really important, and then that translates into what's the value proposition. So, for example, recruitment has always done well out of throwing a lot of volume of people at the issue.
Yeah.
But actually, the value isn't in, with due respect to graduates, I'm a big fan of young people and developing their careers. Totally. If I'm ringing someone for expert advice, I want an expert.
Yes.
So therefore, I'm prepared to pay for an expert. Therefore, there's a breakdown in the value proposition where the customer doesn't see the advice of the recruiter is as valuable as the recruiter sees it.
Yes.
They see it as being, they're just a conduit to get me CVs that I can make decisions on. So if the recruitment business then pivots and changes its method to provide more expertise and more knowledge and more insight at that level, then they should charge for the time. But when you've got a bunch of, people that have never worked in the environment that they recruit for, it's hard to justify.
Of course it is.
But really, I see a lot of things now about retained recruitment and things like that. I think people actually, when I'm training people, on coaching boards, I say, look, Harrods sell carrots, and so does your local corner shop. And you pay 10 times more for them at Harrods, even though they taste the same. But the experience is a whole lot better.
There you go.
Well, it's the same in recruitment. If we gave the client a better experience and more knowledge and, facts about our carrots, they'd pay for them.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because, like you, Steve, I advise the boards of many staffing businesses, typically though on sort of ways of improving equity value prior to a transaction. And actually, if I just reflect on the many businesses that I've worked with over the years, none of them, and I mean not one of them, has had a customer services function.
Right.
But of course, they've all had very overweight sales functions.
Yeah.
It's to the same point, isn't it?
Correct.
We're all focused on the inputs, but no one's thinking about service and, of course, brand and delivering a celebrity service, which means your customers keep coming back time and time again, and they will pay more.
100%. And there are individual recruiters that enjoy that.
Yes.
but there are very few firms that enjoy that.
Right.
And I think, that's the concept of service is often spoken about in recruitment, but very rarely manifests itself in what other people in other sectors would regard as exceptional service.
Right.
I also think that is, when people say right now, the flat earthers say, look, the market will bounce back. We've seen this before. Well, the clients are weaponized.
Yep.
The clients now have more technology and tools that the agency is. The lid's been lifted on the mystery of how recruitment agencies work.
That's right.
So you have to provide service, because what else have you got other than knowledge, expertise, service? Because finding a candidate is not a skill. Anyone's going to do it. Yeah. And it's finding the right candidate, because I understand that client deeper, and I understand the things that they didn't write on the job description that make that candidate a fit. That's what you're going to pay me for. You're not going to pay me for a shortlist.
Yeah, right.
I can go on any platform and get a short. We can do it now on my phone. So why would a client pay a fee for that? Where's the value added? And most agencies don't really understand the value added concept. What else am I doing for that client? What's the extra mile? And that service proposition is critical. So yeah, if recruitment agencies, again, it's a great example about pivoting to different models. If you want to provide service, then make someone responsible for service.
That's right. Well, if it's not measured, it doesn't happen, right?
Correct.
And people sort of talk about delivering a great service, and we care for our clients. It's all old hat stuff. The reality is, how do you measure whether you are delivering that knockout service? And 9 out of 10 recruitment businesses will say, well, we don't. We just sort of have a good feel because our clients are happy. Well, that's not perhaps good enough, is it?
But then you look at other agencies. So again, I'm always trying to look outside in. Lots of companies now have people that are responsible for customer experience, right? Well, there's not many of those in recruitment.
No, there's not.
But we've got customers. How come we don't care about their experience?
That's right. And things like NPS. Again, a few of my very sophisticated, very, very service-oriented recruitment clients do have NPS and monitor. But again, that's few and far between.
Yeah, and yet, for example, NPS is interesting. If you remunerated your recruiters, because I have big issues with commission and things like that, but if you remunerated your recruiters based on NPS, then all of a sudden you would start to achieve new ways of doing things, because you're linking reward to behavior.
That's right.
But most recruitment agencies link reward to outcome.
That's right.
So you can fail 75% of the time and still earn 6 figures, because if the volume's big enough, but the customers, 75% of the customers hate you, right? How's that right? Makes no sense.
And obviously, Steve, I know, because we have many mutual clients and we've worked with many businesses together where you've been board advisor and I've been corporate finance advisor. So I can speak firsthand. But a question, what would you say is the one ingredient that a high growth recruitment business has to have to scale? So, you talked about when you bought your first business, you had 100 heads and, you scaled quite significantly quickly. What was the one ingredient that without, quite frankly, you'd have fell flat quick?
Oh, leadership. 100% of the time. It's still, whatever model you run, the rubber meets the road at leadership.
That's right.
If you've got the right leaders that can engage not only the people, but the customers, and they kind of get it, then your business is going to be successful. However clunky the model. You can take a bad process and put a good leader on top and it'll still work. But if you put a good process with a bad leader, it's going to fail. It's all about leadership. Whatever AI or whatever the model is, whether how important your brand is, if that leadership layer is wrong and it doesn't cut it, you've got to build one or buy one, but you've got to swap them out.
And as a board advisor, how much of your time, Steve, is actually spent developing leaders versus helping leaders run a better business?
Okay, in a lot of the cases of businesses I work with, I spend a lot of time on the leaders because the owners are disconnected or have somehow got a very different view of what they're doing, or in fact, often they're interfering in that progress. I'm very invested in up and coming, high potential people that can make a difference, that have got the dressing room, that people buy into where they're going, and I think they're the people that are the most spectacular successes. And that's really where I try to spend a lot of time. focusing on them. But, you know, not to say the boards or the ownership infrastructure of that business isn't very high value, but they have a different motivation.
Totally.
And therefore, you know, sometimes I'm trying to help them achieve their objective by the people that are actually in the trenches with people.
Yes, yes. So it sounds like, as well as sort of advising boards, actually you do spend time sort of coaching and developing people.
Yeah, I mean, I've never once described myself as a non-exec. I'm more a renter boss,
Yes.
right? You know, I just say to people, look, I still think I can play.
Yep.
And as a result of that, if I come into your business or a business, I will get hands-on. I will get to know your leadership. I'm not trying to influence the board. I'm trying to show the board how to get performance by working with the people that can influence it. So I'm kind of a renter boss. I'll step in.
So that's much more operational, hands-on than a traditional non-executive director would allow themselves to be, right?
Yeah, because I've worked with non-execs before that will tut over their glasses and tell me, you know, tell me stuff about ratios on the balance sheet. And I've spoken to them since, and a lot of them, you know, read the accounts on the way in on the train. You know, they're not invested. I mean, I get fully immersed in what I'm doing.
Yeah.
You know, it actually matters to me. And that comes back from that painful period.
Absolutely.
Like the immersion I get in, I mean, I take it quite personally. I want my clients to succeed, which means I'm happy to have difficult conversations, but I'm also happy to celebrate the success with them. And maybe it's I'm a bit needy. Maybe that's how I get my team fix. I just borrow someone else's team, you know, to do it. But I still think, you know, that's where the power hits the ground. You know, it's at that leadership level.
Got it. And let me ask, with one eye on time, Steve. So obviously, I couldn't respect you more as an advisor to recruitment owners and businesses, because I've seen you in action. And whilst I know you love what you do because it speaks in volumes, let me ask, do you think you still have an appetite to be in equity and to create another business which can have notable value? Or actually is the future for you now all about helping people and businesses realize their potential?
So the answer is both, but the former, in terms of creating something, for me personally, I'm happier in the advisory. I can have more impact on more people in that way. I've had my go, you know, and loved it, and now it's helping others. I co-founded the Ability People in 2018 with a Paralympian, Liz Johnson, and that's a business that I am trying to increase value. Now, we focus on disability inclusion, and we try to make the world of work more accessible for people with disability.
That's great.
They don't need favors. They just need the same treatment as everybody else.
Right.
And so my equity in the business is invested in that.
Yes.
I can bring business skills and a passion for people being treated fairly. So therefore, I guess I'm more intellectually invested in, if I'm going to be involved in something as an owner, that's where my passion is. But in recruitment, that's where my sort of passion and skills and history are.
Right.
So I don't want to own a recruitment company
Got it.
or invest. I'm happy to sit on the sideline and be a coach and sitting in the dugout. You know, there's plenty of people that have been unbelievable, you know, coaches and mentors, but my equity, my ownership's involved in the Ability People.
Steve, my last question for this podcast is, if anyone's watching who are in elevated position in a business, but they are employed, and they've got this like real urge to set up their own business. You know, they don't want to create value for their shareholders. They are not aligned, and quite frankly, they've lost the love, but they've got this issue when it comes to needing a certain income and feeling anxious, taking risks on behalf of their family. What advice would you give that person?
Well, I should probably talk to you to start with, but I think it's a difficult one. If you've got that passion, you've got to scratch the itch. I mean, ultimately, it'll get you in the end. You're going to do it. I would say just make sure you've got a robust plan. You know, a lot of people I meet that call themselves entrepreneurs don't really have a plan, you know, because they trade on the idea that I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm a free spirit. But actually, nothing ever works without a plan.
No.
So you've got to know what you're doing. You've got to make sure that your plan is measured. You know, you understand the downside, but funding and having the available funds to make sure you've got a period of time where you've got a bit of space to make it work. I mean, it'd be difficult to start a business knowing that if day one it didn't work out, you were under pressure straight away.
Yep.
So you make bad decisions. So, but I think most people ultimately, if you've got a plan and you've got the ability and you've got the funding and you believe in what you're doing, and you have to go for it. Because I'd say really, I was a bit late on that. Like I got involved circumstantially. I probably should have backed myself many years before, but circumstantially didn't and just was held back. But actually, it's been a hugely liberating thing to do. And yeah, so people should go for it, but just have a plan. Don't just have a crazy idea and think it works. I see people that open stores, they think everybody's going to want, like in my local village, someone opened an ice cream store. And I'm like, now that's a great dream, but like, I wouldn't open it in my local village where there's no people. The weather's terrible. Right. Why? That's an entrepreneur. That's what I mean. Like, that's an entrepreneur that sat around with friends and said, I'm going to open an ice cream shop. And all their friends went, good idea.
That's right.
That'll be amazing. Right. They won't be there. It won't even make it to summer, I wouldn't think.
No.
And why open it in the middle of winter? And I know a lot of people, even in recruitment, that they're big billers. I can do this. Why am I giving money to the boss? And they break away. And, the numbers, the failure rates are huge.
So high, yeah.
Huge, yeah, because they're just not thought through. No. They're not funded. They don't have the expertise. They don't get the right advice. They just go out there and say, this is great. And the one client they had leaves them, and then they're screwed. So, yeah, think it through before people do it, but have a plan. And if you believe in yourself, back yourself.
Yeah, great advice, Steve. And you said one thing I'm going to have to pick up. Sure. You said that, truth be known, perhaps you should have made the leap 3, 4, 5 years prior. If you had done, do you think what you've achieved would be different?
I've never thought about it like that.
And I guess I'm specifically thinking about what you sort of ran into in terms of the credit crunch and the timing of that, because business is all about timing, right?
Yeah, correct. You know what? On balance, I think probably it worked out the right way for me, because ultimately now I think as a person, not a business person, just generally, I'm better at a lot of things. Sure. Because I learned a lot of stuff about me.
Yes.
And that was true. Maybe I would have got that life lesson some other way. But in terms of opportunity along the way, maybe I'd look back with some regret at some of the opportunity I had to start on my own, where people would back me and do it. But then I guess if I'm taking a balance view, I think probably it was the right time for me when it happened.
Steve, can I just thank you for spending some time with me today on my podcast? It's been phenomenally insightful, so inspiring, and I'm confident our viewers will take away some absolute nuggets. So thank you so much, Steve.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Carl.
It's been an absolute pleasure today spending some time on my podcast with Steve Carter. Steve, of course, is a very experienced businessman and has spent his entire career working in and now on the recruitment sector. As a very experienced entrepreneur, not only has he started up, scaled through acquisition and organic growth, and exited his own recruitment business, but of course he's worked with many boards of many recruitment businesses, providing advice on how to develop, how to scale, how to take cost out of a business during a global pandemic. For me, there's some really great takeaways from today's podcast. The 3 that spring to mind are, for sure, adversity we should all assume in business. It's how you respond that matters the most, not what occurs around you, accepting you can't control the economy. I think the second thing that Steve said himself is he wished he'd scratched his entrepreneurial itch 3, 4 years before. So if you are watching this podcast today and you run a business, but you are an employee in a business and you've always wanted to set up your own business, make sure you have a plan, make sure you know how to execute it, ensure that you have funding and a runway to get to a position where the business becomes self-sufficient. And if you've got those things, what are you waiting for? I think the final thing that Steve has shared with me today, which definitely I will take away, is the importance of customer service. A lot of recruitment businesses focus on sales. a lot of recruitment businesses afford and allow unproductive time. But actually, how many recruitment businesses have a customer services function which is there fully to allow for one to make sure celebrity service is delivered to each customer? You've been watching Confessions of an Entrepreneur, powered by RG. My name is Carl Swansbury. If you'd like to download this podcast or any other podcast in our Confessions of a series, please do from wherever you download your podcasts from. But for now, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on future Confessions of a podcasts.